if we're ashamed of our need for other people, then we will not be able to accept God's love for us.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for the forum, author, and speaker. This morning, we'll hear from Leah Libresco Sargeant, whom I first came across in 2011, during which time I was in a long dialogue with an atheist, a conversation that eventually became a short-term blog called An Atheist and a Catholic. During that time, I began to be introduced to other outspoken modern atheists, as well as some who were considering Christianity. Leah was one of those people who caught my attention, and I became fascinated by her journey and was delighted to learn that she'd be converting to Catholicism. I gladly read her first book, Arriving at Amen, and I've thought of her so often through the years as our world has seemingly become more secular and in a much more outspoken way. How did Leah evade staying in that world of non-belief? What caused her to overcome the challenges she'd carried from being raised as an atheist Jew in terms of seeing the good of Christianity? Her story remains intriguing to me, and I'm among those who have cheered her along the way as she struggled through the challenges of miscarriage, the joys of motherhood, and simply living out being Catholic in a world that is largely hostile to religion. In this environment, Leah is a light. When I reached out to her recently, I learned she was working on her third book, The Dignity of Dependence, and the title alone drew me in. Happily, Leah agreed to share a little bit about her conversion, as well as dive into her brand new book, which carries the subtitle, A Feminist Manifesto. I prefaced this conversation that despite my several decades on Leah, her intellect far exceeds mine. Leah is a math person who loves statistics, and she can write and speak at a high level. I prefer words and tend to freeze up whenever a number happens upon my path. But we're both Catholic wives and mothers who love our faith and our families, so I trust we'll have enough to share to make the conversation worthwhile. I know that Leah will. A key line in her book goes like this: when the world starts with a false image of the human person, it is difficult to become rooted in truth. Ponder that for a moment, but not too long. I don't want to keep Leah waiting. There's so much to share today, and we're going to dive deeply into a topic of both earthly and eternal consequence. So let's go. Well, welcome, Leah, to Matters of Soul Importance. I'm so glad you're here with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
So I want to share a little bit about your book today, The Dignity of Dependence, which has the subtitle of Feminist Manifesto, some fighting words in there, I would say. And our question today will be, is dependency a bad word? So we're going to get into that. But before we do, Leah, if you could give me an abbreviated version of your conversion story, because I want our listeners to kind of know where you're coming from. I know that you started out as an atheist. So tell us about your life and how you ended up becoming a Catholic of all things.
Yeah, so I grew up as an atheist in a relatively unreligious part of Long Island. I don't think I knew any Christians, qua Christians, until I went to college. So there were some demographically around, but I didn't know their own faith journeys or their relationship with God. And my experience of Christians was really heavily mediated through what kind of Christians are on TV or in the news. I remember hearing Jerry Falwell say that Hurricane Katrina came to New Orleans to punish the homosexuals, right? And that meant that, the lens on Christianity I had is, where does Christian faith pose a threat to other people or become politically controversial? And that didn't really change for me until I went to college, went to Yale, joined the debating society where you argue only things you actually think, not randomly chosen sides. And the stakes are, will you live the whole rest of your life differently based on this speech? And I met really smart Christians, and that piqued my curiosity because I thought, why are these smart, curious, interesting people like me, not only Christians, but some of them Christian converts? And it meant I had to learn more about Christianity than I had till that point, partly because I wanted my friends to stop being Christians.
What was it about the Christian faith beyond that drew you in? What were some of the questions that you had as you started getting more interested in Christianity that had to be solved?
Yeah, so I think one of my questions was, are there points in this theological view that are just self-contradictory. Okay, get my friends out of this by finding a contradiction that means they have to give up the whole thing. And, that meant doing more and more reading. And I found it was more of a seamless garment than I thought. I thought it was false, but I thought it was well constructed. And then for me, that's kind of enough to start working on, like, what am I trying to get from Christianity for the sake of my friends? But what could it do for me? And I would say that kind of in my navigations in theology and philosophy, the North Star my compass was oriented towards was always the question of how do we come to know what is good? I was a moral realist from the start, including as an atheist, which means I think of morality as something we uncover like archaeologists, not something we build like architects. We respond to something, we don't create it. But the challenge is, it's easier to articulate for some parts of the world. Well, how do I come to know the world outside myself? Well, I see it with my eyes. I hear it with my ears. I know something about how the outside world comes into me. But when I talk about my conscience and how I make sure it's a well-formed conscience, what am I working with here? And what does it respond to in the world? It's not patterns of light, but I know there's something out there. I felt like, a person who lived before Newton's theory of optics, right? It'd be strange to say, oh, I don't believe in vision because I've never dissected an eye. I couldn't dissect my conscience, but it was very clear I had one and that it responded imperfectly to something external to me out there in the world.
So how did the people around you help in that way? And we're talking about dependence here. You had little lights along the way. What were some of those moments that made you kind of stop and reconsider what you'd been learning with New Atheism?
I think there were a lot of small moments. That conversion is really a relay race, but the pivotal final moment, the crossing of the finish line, came when I was having a long discussion with a friend about how it could be that I have knowledge of something transcendent when I kept struggling to articulate a way that I build a ladder up by induction. And then I kind of blurted out, casting around for a different explanation, I guess morality just loves me or something. And for me, that was the pivotal moment, because when I'm talking suddenly about morality as something capable of love, I'm talking about a being, not just a rule book. And once you're talking about a being who is goodness, who loves, who lowers himself to you, taking the form of a slave, I know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Christ. I'm talking about the incarnation. I'm talking about the Christian God who bridged the gap between the infinite and the mortal out of love.
Thinking back to that moment, sometimes we speak something out loud and it's like we realize how true it is when we speak it or when we hear someone else speak it. What was that moment like for you and the others in the room when you said that?
It was just me and my friend Ben, and I'll say it was a little bit like doing a computer science problem set for me, which is, there's a moment where I have to write this code. I know it needs to get from point A to point B. And there'll even be a moment where while I'm working on the problem, I know I have the solution, even though I haven't written it down all the way yet. And I don't even have the words for the solution myself. It's just, there's a moment where you're like, wait, I've got it. Now I've got to start writing it and see what's going to come out as I do it. But I have it. And it felt like that.
It was like truth.
Yes.
And did you feel like, I almost sense that you might have felt maybe not a little bit like vulnerable in that moment? Like, oh my gosh, there's something here that I don't know. Was there a vulnerability or not?
I think more just a like light, right? Like, something is there that wasn't there. Something is larger than you thought.
Beautiful. And I know at some point you married a Catholic, but
later on, yes.
Right. How long did that process take for
marrying him or converting?
Converting.
Okay. The marrying was much faster.
I bet.
If you think about conversion as a process that starts when I'm born, then it took 22 years. But if you count it from when I started having these conversations and getting curious, then probably 5.
Were there any conversations in your past, like growing up in your family, that came back to you? I'm sure there were, and maybe you can't think of one specific, but were there certain ideas that had been presented to you as a child or growing up, or experiences that you had that later it made more sense in the light of truth?
I think the key thing is that my parents gave me the tools to get here, even though they didn't mean for those tools to lead me here. My parents are both college professors. They're really invested in seeking the truth, seeking it openly and curiously, and without being afraid of it being an uncomfortable truth. And without that, I don't know if I would get here, or certainly not in this way.
What would you say the differences are between living a life without God, without faith, and what it's like now for you? Sort of just pitting those up against each other. What are some of the differences in terms of your life and how you live?
I'd highlight two big differences that I had to make a shift when I became a Christian. And one was just more appreciation of the material world. That as an atheist, I had more of a sense of, my body is a mech suit for my intellect. And I don't want the mech suit to break, right? But there's nothing intrinsically good about it. And as a Christian, that's not the promise God's made. Our bodies are us and are a gift for our sanctification. So I actually tried to cook more rather than kind of take the recent college grad approach of, okay, on this spreadsheet, what's the reasonably sustainable calories for the lowest price, no matter how boring the meal is. I'm like, well, that's not actually respectful to what God has done in, making me an embodied being. So that was shift number one. And shift number two, I'd say, is just, I can approach more things that go beyond my own capacity because God can complete what I begin. And, that was a big feature of my conversion. A lot of people, I think, had frustrating conversations with me that went nowhere, and might have thought, well, that was for nothing. But they were part of a relay race and they didn't see everyone else who held the baton.
I also just sense the freedom that you just described of finding that there's a door that you can go through that it's just has more rooms than you even imagined, right?
Yes.
What were some of the stumbling blocks? So I'm sure there were certain issues, Mary, I don't know, what were there's always the key things that keep you from going all the way into Christianity or even Catholicism. What were some of those big stumbling blocks that took a while?
I mean, the biggest one was just, is this true? Right. And, that's what shifted. And I think, there were a lot of parts of Catholic sexual morality I found both unintuitive and unattractive in the beginning. And as I was arguing with my friends, I did find that they made more sense as a unity than any of them did considered in isolation. Catholic teaching on what marriage is, Catholic teaching on what abortion is, Catholic teaching on what contraception is, those three all make more sense as part of a triangle together than if you consider any one of those ideas totally in isolation.
Right. I'm going to read a quote from your book, and I think this will kind of set us up to begin speaking about your book. And it is, our sense of ourselves as autonomous sets us up to be endlessly disappointed by living in relation with the world. Exclamation point.
Yeah.
I think, that word autonomous, I could have used that as the title, but I wanted to focus on dependence. However, autonomous is the opposite, I guess, of it. What sort of issues do we get into when we focus on our autonomy and our independence, which really is a large issue with our society and our world right now? What are some of the pitfalls that we can begin to enter into this conversation of dependence and not be so scared of it?
Well, I like you highlighting the two poles here of autonomy and dependence, because autonomy is, in our present society, an aspirational word. Dependence is a dangerous word. And I picked it very deliberately. And that question of what does it mean for this to be dignity? And what does this mean for this to be a feminist manifesto, a book that tells me it's going to pick a fight with me about this dangerous word? And the reason I say dependence is a dangerous word is that we hear, as a matter of law and culture in the United States, that dependence can make you vulnerable, not just in the ordinary way that dependence is descriptively vulnerable, I need something from someone, but it can make you vulnerable as a licit target for killing under the law. It is the dependence of a baby in the womb that is marked out as the reason it might be legal or even expected to kill this human person, because they need something from someone else in this very intimate way. And we see also at the end of life, as with the expansions of medical aid in dying or euthanasia, that we look at people's need as unpersoning them. That in America, when you look at the most commonly cited reasons for seeking euthanasia, it's not the pain of dying, the experience of the disease. It's the fear that you need too much, that you will become burdensome to someone else. And therefore, it might make sense that you be killed, that you, in fact, are expected, obliged, applauded for choosing to be killed rather than need something from someone else, the way a baby does.
You can see the logic there and how dangerous it is. I pulled another quote here. Any interruption is my enemy. And you were talking about, becoming pregnant and the potential to have that life and go through with it, but any interruption, and that children are an interruption. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how inconvenient children are and how that has set us up for this mindset and how we can begin to think about it a little bit differently?
Yeah, that quote, "Any interruption is my enemy," came from a coworker of mine when I was living out in California, when he was talking about how do you plan something efficiently? How do you set up your workspace? And he's like, well, anything that distracts me from my purpose, like, has to go. That, you think these aren't costly, but it's like having multiple alarm clocks going off all the time. He wants this total unity of purpose, which requires nothing outside himself to impinge on him. And when he said this, I'm like, well, in my head, like, that is a standard parents cannot meet, because what it means to be a parent is to be vulnerable to someone else. We're having this conversation right now while my son is being watched by, his nanny. So, there are moments where I kind of make space where I don't expect to be interrupted. But even now, if he threw up while we were talking, she'd be down in a second and you'd be in big trouble.
And should have big eyes and going, ah!
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, we think of this as really a paradigmatic experience of parenthood. You're at the beck and call of someone who simply cannot solve problems without you and who could have problems on any kind of schedule whatsoever. But when we think of the experience of people who are childless, like, they're not untouchable. And the extent to which they are, it means their lives have gotten probably smaller than they themselves want. I had a coworker call out sick this week, not because he was sick and not because a child was sick, but because a friend of his was having a medical crisis and he was the one standing in the gap until his friend's mom could come be with him in the hospital. That's unusual. I have a particularly good workplace where you can say openly, I'm out sick to take care of a friend. But I think that is how we're made to be, that none of us should be totally free of interruptions most of the time, because we have enough people we love that occasionally someone will have a crisis that implicates us or requires us.
Boy, as working mothers, we face that all the time. And I can tell you the many, many times and the interviews that I've done in my garage and different things that have interrupted. And there's always that temptation to be annoyed. And then I think all of us have ultimately, as mothers, come back to no, like, what is the need in front of me? What is the most pressing thing? And there are seasons in our life, as you're in a season right now, where that is really, really deep and the needs are great, but it is a season. Right now I'm actually sitting in my house alone, which is rare. Mm-hmm. My husband and my youngest son who live with us, and we have another son living with us right now too. They're both young adults, but they're away at the moment. So I have this quiet house. However, I do have some pets that could interrupt. I mean, there's always
yes,
something.
There's always something.
Yeah. And if my phone could ring, in fact, it did while we were talking, there are things, people are needing us all the time. So what are the dangers and what is the blessing to either one of those in recognizing our dependence? Because I will say that reading this book, it touched on so many things. I thought a lot about my early motherhood. Even I think you mentioned how when we become mothers, we're more dependent on, and we also are more vulnerable ourselves,
yes.
Which was so true. I remember, this seems kind of drastic, but I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, I had a couple of dreams that someone was shooting me in the stomach. I know that's really graphic, but I think the symbolism was I used to be a runner. I was in track. I was fast. Now I can't move as quickly. Mm-hmm. If I were in danger, I would be completely powerless. And I think that's what was coming out in my dream, is that I felt this new powerlessness and vulnerability. And it really does reframe how you look at the world. And if you cling tightly to the autonomy aspect, it's a losing proposition.
I mean, something is always going wrong, right? Your love is always exposing you to becoming less than or smaller, right? Because things can go wrong for you. I think that's, false as a way to see it, right? But more importantly, it really misstates the whole thing. Our loves for other people do make us vulnerable, do kind of break open other plans, but they also let us be larger than just ourselves. If I am someone who is willing to be vulnerable, actually not even an option, we all are vulnerable, willing or no, willing to acknowledge my vulnerability, ask for help, treat that as a natural part of the ebb and flow of human life, I can take on things that are bigger than myself. Taking on having a child, which literally makes me bigger than my normal self is, makes me more tired, gives me something I kind of can't sustain fully on my own, or at least not while doing other things. I need other people to rush in to care for me in the same way my whole body is turned inward, rushing in to give blood, calcium, etc., to my baby. And that kind of radial movement of, I have someone I must care for. I turn in towards them. I ask others to turn in towards me, is how we all take on things larger than what we ourselves could author. How we're able to be stewards of what God gives us as a gift.
Right. Another quote here that I pulled out: children offer a very specific challenge to our ownership.
Yes.
Which is so true. Yeah. They really help reframe things. And now we have sort of the idea of a lot of young people not to have children. At all, which is disturbing to me, because how do we learn these things? How do we learn our utter and radical dependence on others and how people are dependent on us without taking that next step? It's a dead end. It's a not a flourishing of humanity when we have taken that route. Do you have any concerns about that, Leah?
I think it certainly represents some kind of failure of hope, right? Not necessarily that the person is opting into that as a failure, but it reflects that they have less hope for the world. And part of that is, do I believe that other people will help me when I'm stuck? If I'm going to make myself vulnerable in this way in welcoming a child, do I think in those moments of vulnerability, someone will turn in to me in the way I'm turning into my child and make this doable? I think a lot of our fertility crunch is downstream of the big marriage gap that's happening more and more. Fewer and fewer people are getting married. They're getting married later. And even though, a little bit the desire for marriage has decreased somewhat, it has not decreased by this much. So what you're seeing is more and more people who wish to be married are not getting married at all, or not getting married on the timeline they hope for that would make it easiest to have children. And I think, if you saw a resurgence of marriage, you would see at least something of a bounce in people's number of children.
So what is the answer? You've laid things out. There's more we can say, I know, but I'm troubled by the results of our thinking here. And I think a lot about the women that I encounter on the sidewalk of our only abortion facility here in my area. It really has, your book really has in so many ways been a touch points for me I've already thought deeply about it because I've been doing it for a long time, and I've really had to think about what must they be going through to get to this point. Yep. But your book gave me kind of a new framework for kind of understanding their predicament. Even, when we can, reach out with resources and such, they don't believe it. They do not believe it because they've been trained and told that they're dependent. How do we begin to turn this around? There's got to be some sort of solution. What is yours?
I think a big part of this is kind of offering that personal testimony that you don't find dependence or need disgusting or unpersoning. And, part of that is advocating for people who are vulnerable by reason of their dependence, the unborn, the elderly, the disabled. But another piece of it is that more person-to-person thing of, when you are sick, ask a friend to come over and help you. And that's a vulnerable thing, right? I'm really sick. I have a stomach bug. I can't get out of bed. Could you come run laundry for me? My disgusting laundry, to a friend, right? That is what we expect a spouse to do. But I think, again, especially in an age when people have less marriage, it's not clear who will take care of you when you're sick. And the more we can kind of invite other people into our moments of more abject need, the more both our own lives are enriched, our friendships are strengthened, and that friend suddenly knows, okay, if I have a big embarrassing need, I guess Leah thinks it's normal. You would ask someone to help with that, and not because you're paying them and finding a stranger to care for you, but that this is the office of a friend. So I think you really need to pair that political advocacy with that personal witness.
Right. I remember when as you're talking, I had 5 little kids, and I really didn't, I knew I needed help. We don't have parents right in the area. I was envious of people who did. It was even hard to get a babysitter, for that many kids. It takes a special babysitter to be able to do that. Maybe you need 2 babysitters, and I couldn't afford 2 babysitters. But so I remember feeling very isolated and, kind of alone in that, but I didn't know how to reach out. I just didn't know how to do it and part of it was, I don't think the world knows how to do that. And so, you know what I mean? It feels so big when you talk about it. It seems so easy. Why didn't I just reach out, but I didn't
because we get that counter witness again and again that, you should only ask for what you can reciprocate. You shouldn't ask for someone to do something unpaid that you could afford to pay someone to do as a stranger, right? And that, I think the encouraging thing, you asked for a sign of hope here, right, is that this flywheel goes in both directions. If there's fewer and fewer asks, fewer and fewer moments of trust, it becomes harder to extend across that gap. But similarly, I don't want people to overestimate how much of a witness it takes to shift the norm within your friendships or your neighborhood, that when one person starts asking more, it's easier for other people to respond with their own asks. One thing I'm really grateful for is that in my parish community, there's a listserv for Catholic women in the neighborhood, a parallel one for Catholic men. And, the amount of asking that happens is enormous because there's a clear forum for making those asks. So someone tonight is dropping off a gym uniform for me because they're back ordered and school starts next week and I need a gym uniform for my kid so that she can go to gym. And she's just dropping an extra one off. And then she's going to do extra laundry that week and I'm going to do extra laundry that week because neither of us will have a full complement of gym uniforms, but there's no, and then you pay me back or you lend me something later. Every mom in our neighborhood gets 10 meals from the community, just as a recurring sign up thing. I was without a car seat one day because I left it in my husband's car and needed to go to the city. And I was like, I need a car seat in the next 15 minutes on the listserv. And someone responded. So when there's a space for needs to be shared, more and more needs come out. And, those are material needs that are kind of easier to meet. But what winds up happening is then people are saying things like, okay, my mom has to go into assisted living. Who will sit down with me and tell me what you did when your mother had to do this, right? And that's a much bigger ask in some ways.
I loved that when you were talking about that. And you also talked about something that I had already instituted with a friend of mine. So I have a friend who's my prayer partner. When we go out on Wednesdays, we go to mass and then we go out for a light lunch of soup. But we had gotten, because we do this every week, pretty much, we gotten into the habit of, you take it this time, I'll take it next time. And so it becomes whose turn is it? Oh yeah, it's your turn this time. And I love that. And I realized that just kind of happened naturally. It was one of the things that you recommended, not always offering to buy, everything, but to take turns if you have that kind of relationship that you can do that. And without even thinking too much about it, I've come to love it. There's something different about it when you're taking turns and it's just an expectation. And obviously it has to be a certain situation and a certain kind of friendship, but it's just, it's neat. There's a lightness to it and a familiarity to it. I don't know, but it goes with what you're saying, and I love that idea.
It suggests this is continuing, right? And I think that's what gives that type of lightness, right? When something isn't tightly reimbursed, tightly reciprocated, when it doesn't have to be even splits at the end, it's because you expect to have another encounter. That when I buy a book at a store, if I say, oh, well, I'm $5 short, but that's fine. The person at the bookstore is not going to say that's fine because I'm a stranger to them.
Right.
And there's no guarantee they'll see me again or I'll be back. I'm unknown to them, but it's easier and it sustains a friendship. It kind of is the mark of a friendship that I can go, well, I'll pick it up this time. I know I'll see you again. We can have this kind of sloshing mutual indebtedness of, I'm bringing you food because you're sick. Am I going to get sick in the next week? Gosh, I hope not. But there will be some moment where we're with each other again. Our relationship does not end here today, and therefore it doesn't have to be even.
Things aren't always transactional. We can give without counting the cost in those situations. And it feels so good to be able to do that. We're just not really used to doing that.
And we can have uneven relationships in both directions, right? A parent's relationship with a child is uneven. And it's not the child's job to pay back in the same currency or same magnitude. Even when a child cares for their aging parent, maybe you're changing diapers too, just like they did for you. But it's not that we tally up and go oh, okay, it's okay to be a child because you might change exactly the same number of diapers for your parent at the end. You're just giving and receiving love without counting the cost and without worrying about being even. And you, as a child, will one day pass on the unconditional love you were given, whether to a spouse or another child or a friend. But you'll give it unidirectionally without needing to be even in just the same way your parents gave it to you.
I love that. Leah, I want to take a short little break here, but there's so much more to say, and I know you have limited time because you have little ones waiting, but let's take a short break and we'll be back with more Matters of Soul Importance with Leah Libresco Sargeant after this break.
Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. Leah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the story here. One of the things I wanted to ask about specifically and not leave is the Feminist Manifesto, the subtitle that you've chosen. It's getting to be a tough word there, feminist. There's so many things that conjures up. What do you mean by feminist? And then go into why you chose that as a subtitle.
Absolutely. And that's a question I got from some folks who are like, well, if this is about what it means to be human, like, isn't that just everyone? Is there a reason to use something so divisive as feminist here as a way of getting there? And for me, the reason is actually pretty straightforward. I think women are more intimately marked by dependence than men, most obviously through pregnancy. That there are moments in a woman's life, whether she ever is pregnant or not, that she just knows that she's exposed to the needs of others in a more vulnerable, more intimate, and unchosen way than men are. And so you kind of can't give an account of our dependence without carving out a special place for what pregnancy is and does. Now, this isn't an experience that's totally alien to men because, of course, they're on the receiving side of it. Pregnancy is something that all of us benefit from and are intimately tied up in. But part of what I think can be frustrating is that when we try and frame the experience of being human neutrally, we shortchange men and women. There's no humans as pure sexless humans walking around. And since there are real asymmetries between men and women, fertility being one of the most obvious, when we try and figure out, well, how do we account for dependency? If we do it in a sex neutral way, we will shortchange women in particular.
As you were talking, Leah, I don't know, I hope this isn't like taking us in a different direction, but I thought about birth control and the word autonomous and independence, and how that may be a factor here in how our culture has shifted to maybe a more dangerous direction. Would you have anything to say about that?
I think in some ways it's interesting that people talk about birth control as removing the risk of sex or making this less relevant, making women be able to live more like men as people who can have sex without getting pregnant. But of course, birth control kind of always is paying a tribute to what sex is oriented towards, because if sex couldn't make you pregnant as a woman, you wouldn't need to have this daily reminder of taking a pill every day, going to the doctor every 3 months, putting on a condom, right? So, birth control both obstructs the natural end of sex, but it's always reminding you that that is the natural end, and it frames it as a threat. And I think reasonably, it does feel like a threat if you feel like your own exposure to the need of a child won't be met with compassion from people around you. Now, I think the critical thing is you can have all the birth control in the world and there will still be someone in your life who needs you. And this is part of why dependency is not only a woman's issue. If you took pregnancy completely off the table for a given person, they'd still be themselves someone who started as a baby, sheltered by pregnancy, cared for by a particular woman. And God willing, they'd be able to make a gift of their life in other ways to other people by caring for them in their dependency. But even if, let's say, you're Ebenezer Scrooge, who depended on other people as a baby, can't get pregnant, and then uses his money to insulate himself from ever exposing need or vulnerability to anyone else, you will still die. You can, use all the birth control you want, and you will one day be dying and need other people. So dependency is something we can only kind of put up brief temporary shelters against. It is not something we can uproot from human life.
Right. Absolutely. And what are, go into a few more of the dangers of that kind of mental thought, because I think some people are probably going to still be struggling with it. I mean, the book really lays it out nicely, and so you can kind of understand. But just speaking here on the podcast, what are some of the other dangers of not entering into this idea of dependency as a good.
I think there's a worldly danger and a spiritual danger. And the worldly one is simply factually, you need other people. And if you don't respond to that need by reaching out to ask for help, by offering what's excess in your life to others, then you will simply do less well. You won't have help when you're sick. You won't, the extra coat in your closet goes unworn and is frustrated in its telos of caring for someone who is cold, right? So you have all those kind of missed opportunities moment to moment. But I think beyond that, especially as Christians, we can see there's a deeper spiritual danger, which is if we're ashamed of our need for other people, then we will not be able to accept God's love for us. A stranger who you pay, you may be able to fully reimburse for the value of their labor. You could go out to dinner and always be exact splitsies with a friend, so no one is ever owing to anyone else. But you cannot have that relationship with God. God gives to us in a way we cannot repay. We can return love to him, but we're only returning what he himself has already given us for the purpose of loving him. It's like when dad goes to pick out his birthday present with his kid, pays for his own birthday present, helps the kid wrap the present, right? And then would it be right for the kid to say like, well, I've really paid you back for loving me here, right? And none of that is bad, right? It's beautiful that the child wants to love beyond their own means and that the dad reaches in to help the child give a shape to that love. That's what God does for us. But if we hate ourselves for needing others or think we're unpersoned by needing others on that horizontal person-to-person relationship, then we will be ashamed of being loved by God.
I love that. And I have a memory. That's why I was giggling, is my sister and I going to a drugstore and our mom waited outside while we ran in and bought gifts for her. I don't know if it was an anniversary or birthdays, but because we got some lipstick for her and some shampoo for my dad that we knew he liked. And then, but we were pretty young. So yeah, it's funny. What about the church? How does the church help us in this? Because how does the church help us realize our dependency and usher in a way to live that out?
Yeah, I think one of the ways it does it is just that you could meet anybody at church. That it's unfortunately normal in America to live a relatively age and class segregated lifestyle where when I first moved to DC, I saw mostly other young professional 20-somethings in roughly the same salary band, except for the lawyers, right? And at church, because the Catholic Church is Catholic, small c Catholic, universal, that's where I saw disabled teenagers, embedded in their family. That's where I met people much older than myself who had mobility needs, because everyone must come here to receive Christ. So I think the first thing the church does for us, aside from actually giving the sacrament, is it draws us together with people unlike ourselves. It makes it easier for us to hear where the Holy Spirit may be inviting us to ask for help or to give it. And it does give us the reassurance that none of us are ever without a way to care for others. Even if you yourself have physical limitations, are poor, because you can pray for someone else, you're never without a way to care for them.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the relational aspect too of all of this, how relational we are? Because I think that's all tied into it. And of course, God is a relationship with each other, with a Trinity is a relationship. And then he is, it's an outward movement, not drawing into ourselves, right? We're drawing outward where the fruits are spilling out. God created the world out of love that spilled out. It couldn't be contained.
And you see that again paralleled in fertility, right? Which is part of what's so beautiful about it, is that it's a sign of what does it look like when love is too much, right? When love spills over and is so much that it is another human person, that when a man and woman come together in their love for each other, it is possible their love is so great that it can be a whole other person. Now, it's in some ways a very small image or piece of an image of what we see in the Trinity, that God, loving Christ, gives us the Holy Spirit as the full flowering of their love between each other. And that, that's really a big encouragement, that our need can be fruitful, that our need is not just taking away from someone else in this zero-sum way, but, our need for, our longing for, our relationship with someone else is not, well, when I love my husband or when I ask something from him, I take away from what he has to give to me. But this, moving back and forth can be greater than the sum of its parts.
One of the best lines that my spiritual director gave me some years ago that has stayed with me and kind of provoked a different movement in this regard was the line, when I am weak, you are strong. It's just simple, but it was me realizing that when I'm weak and when I can accept and voice my vulnerability, God has more room to work.
And that's where I really want to turn this conversation a little bit back to, what does this feminist manifesto mean for men, right? Like, is this, well, here's how men can help women more, but otherwise, they should get out of the way, which I think is sometimes what men hear from some of these pitches. And of course, when I talk about pregnancy as paradigmatic, there's the question of, all right, well, then are men just supposed to really admire this thing women can do, but where do they belong? And that language of where I'm weak, you are strong, I think is actually kind of the key idea of how these relationships of dependency both ennoble men and women. That I would say the paradigmatic, not the only, but the paradigmatic example of how women respond to the needs of others is shown to us in pregnancy. It is caring for someone in an unchosen way. That, moment to moment, I can neither conceive the baby by myself, nor, unfortunately, keep them alive by a sheer act of will. But I am here, willing their good moment to moment, even though I'm not directing the flow of oxygen, the heartbeat of blood to them. And I can't stop caring for them, even in moments of, I'm so tired, or I feel sick. None of that can actually endanger the baby directly, because it doesn't take my ongoing willing to care for them. And to be honest, it was a huge reassurance for me for labor, because, I had that feeling of, well, what if it's too much? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. I can't get off. It's like a roller coaster. So I can be small in the face of this, and that won't stop the baby from being born, because even if I'm overwhelmed, my body is going to keep working. And that made me feel better. I don't think it makes everyone feel better. But then look at the parallel experience, the experience of my husband during pregnancy. He can't care for the baby directly. He can care for me, who is made weaker by the baby and needs more from him in that moment. And in the delivery room, again, I am having the labor, and he is caring for me. We took the Bradley method approach to childbirth, where, it was really relying on him as much as the midwives to get through labor, because he was not physically implicated in the same way. So he was freer to care for me. But what would it mean for either of us to give up in that moment? For me, it was not an option, right? Giving up is only an internal feeling, but the baby is doing something no matter what. But for him, if there was a moment where he was overwhelmed or exhausted, he was always free to leave the room. To get a different kind of courage in the midst of care from men and from women, paradigmatically. For women, it's embracing something unchosen that cannot be escaped, but you shape your interior disposition towards caring for this person. And for men, there's an act of specific physical courage of staying in a hard moment that you could walk away from. And I think we don't talk enough about this particular masculine virtue. Like every virtue, courage is available for men and women, but this feeling of, I am caring for someone vulnerable who I could walk away from, that kind of tension of, I am helping, but I'm also powerless to lift this cross from my wife's shoulders. I can just be with her in the midst of it. That's something men have that's really beautiful. And it's kind of the answer to, why are men stronger than women? Why can't both sexes have babies? That there's this complementary asymmetry where what women undergo, men can choose to accompany them in their own complementary way. And, I really want men to read this book, not just so that they can better love or respect the women in their lives, but because men have real gifts that I think they feel thwarted or are unsure how to share. And it's a real loss. For instance, if everyone in the neighborhood is, paying gardening services rather than asking teenage boys to come shovel them out or clean up their yard, because there's a real sense of that as a boy is growing to be a man, he's growing to be strong. He's figuring out what to do with it. It's almost like the beginning of Spider-Man movies where Spider-Man accidentally breaks a doorknob, because he doesn't know, what do I do with all of this inside me? And the answer is, that's given to you to make a gift of. And we have to be better at asking men to use their strength and really welcome that as men's strength, to say, you were given this to give to someone. I can't block up the channel of that gift.
Yeah, absolutely. I come back to the sidewalk where the abortions are happening every week here. And one of the things that I noticed early on was we have our men and they kind of take up posts on the outside. And then the women are kind of on the inside being motherly, having that motherly presence. And they're on the outside, but we need them. Like, I will not go there unless there's a man there to be protective if something should happen and to defend me. And I just think it's lovely and just flies in the face of those who say men shouldn't be out there. Like, yes, it's not their issue, and I'm like, no, I need the protection. Like, I know I'm vulnerable there. I know if something should happen that I would be protected. But not only that, we have grasped onto this idea, some of us, in terms of reaching out to the women and the men. And actually, we've had more saves. I have been personally involved in someone leaving the abortion facility when I was able to talk to the man and instill in him and empower in him what you're talking about, that he was made to defend life and to protect life. And they know that innately. And so if you can just remind them and empower them in that moment, that's when we've had success with them saying, no, I can do this. I can be supportive. And it's such a part of who they are. It's such a beautiful gift. And we need that. And I think you're right. They've been kind of beaten down and forgotten. So we need to remind men of how valuable they are. And you have a son, I have 3 sons, and it's a message that isn't getting out there enough. Leah, before we close here, I know you have to go soon. What are some of the ways your children have instructed you in this book, The Dignity? You bring them up a lot, and I just think it's lovely. What are some of the maybe some stories you can tell us about how your children have instructed you in the gift of dependency?
Well, they ask a lot of me, but I think one thing that's very moving is that they are also moved by my own need. Like, they can be puzzled by it sometimes. I remember there was a moment when, I was telling my first daughter to be more gentle because I was pregnant with my third. I needed her not to jump on my belly, right? Like to be patient when I was slow. And, I'm like, I'm delicate. And she's like, but you're big. And to her, like, this expansion of pregnancy, like, how could it not be a sign of being stronger if you're bigger? Bigger is better, right? But they learn a lot of delicacy from me, and they learn even more from each other, right? So I think there's always a sense of, am I shortchanging my children when I have a next child? And the answer, I want to say really straightforwardly, is yes, in some ways, right? There are moments where, one kid has fallen down, but, the other kid is napping on me. So am I going to come to them right away? Or am I going to try and ask them to solve it by themselves? Like, everyone gets less of my unmixed attention. Like, you want me to read you a book. You want me to get you art supplies. Like, I can't do this for both of you at the same time. That's hard. But what do they get in return for that? I think the thing that's really striking is they are endlessly exposed to a small, vulnerable person who awes them with their smallness. And of course, when you're a kid, there are only so many people who are smaller than you. And they learn to be delicate and gentle and quiet for their little brother's sake in a way they would not be willing to be quiet or gentle just for my sake. Because I'm so big, it's hard for them to conceive of me as needing anything from them. But their brother calls out their sensitivity to need, and it's so different. It would never occur to them that because he needs things from them, he's less of a person, right? Or, could be exposed to the violence of abortion because he needs things. They love that there's a purpose for their scrambling around. They love to bring a spit up cloth. They love that their love can spill over in this embodied way for him.
I love that. Children can be really open us up to our dependency, obviously, and also this idea that love expands. It doesn't shrink. When we are open to life, more love comes into the world, not less. And so that's one of the things that every child that's taken abruptly by abortion, less love is flowing into the world. I don't care what the circumstances are. We've just lost a whole branch of a tree. So your book really touched on a lot of that for me. And I just thank you so much. Are there any other, do you want any other takeaways from your book and the experience of writing it that you want to leave us with before we have to say goodbye today, Leah?
I think for everyone listening, I'd love it if in the next week you did one ask that's a little hard for you from someone else, to just open those channels of need and love. And I think one of the simplest ones, if you're not sure how to do it, is to ask someone to pray for you for something you genuinely need prayers for. And I think it's always a good idea when you're with another Christian to, by the time you close out your conversation, to say, is there anything I can pray for you? Because I just can't tell you how many times I spent hours with a friend and not heard that their mom was in the hospital until her hand was on the doorknob. And I said, oh, and is there anything we should pray for before you go? We really are surrounded by so much more need and so many more opportunities for love than we realize. And it can be a very small question that opens that up to us.
That's beautiful. And I want to thank you for saying yes to my ask and being with us today and taking some time away from your children. But hopefully our discussion gave you energy that you can now give to your children, right? So there's a fruit from this, I'm hoping. So,
amen.
All right. Well, thank you, Leah. You have a beautiful day. And thanks for your time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Is dependency a bad word? Before I answer that, let me say that I'm grateful for the outro because sometimes life doesn't work as perfectly as we'd hoped. Sometimes we have to depend on an alternate plan for reaching the intended end. And my outro today gives me a needed do-over. Let me explain. Leah and I had gotten through at least 10 minutes, maybe more, of our interview before I realized we weren't recording at all. I let her finish her thought, and then we restarted, but now with 15 minutes fewer than we'd planned on. It made for a quicker setup than I'd wanted, but Leah was excellent at going with the flow, and I'm so grateful to have gotten a chance to hear some of her profound thoughts on the topic of dependence. Her book, as I mentioned, was a paradigm shifter for me. Much of what she shared about dependence connected with my own experiences, especially in becoming a mother. But it wasn't until reading The Dignity of Dependence that all the dots began connecting, causing me to reflect back on moments in my life when I realized how dependency was not an option, such as in my first baby's refusal to take a bottle, which meant that I was going to have to figure out another way to feed him. That realization alone changed my life in countless ways. Later on, trying to pump breast milk in a bathroom stall on a strict 15-minute work break woke me up to the fact that my babies needed me in a way I could not avoid, and it would mean making a drastic change in my career plans. That change ultimately put me on a path that embedded me in a deeper purpose for why God had put me on this earth. While it was not easy to fit this new reality into the culture that had other ideas about dependence, I'm eternally thankful for my children, who in their radical dependency on me, pointed me to my truest value. I'm grateful also to my husband for his tireless efforts to make it possible for me to be with them the majority of their most tender years. It is not easy to raise a family in a world that values autonomy over dependency, but learning the lessons I did changed my life in a sometimes challenging, but ultimately eternally edifying way. I'm grateful for having been so needed and for those who came around me in my need and continue to. Also, as you've noticed, the topic of abortion comes up a lot in this interview, something near and dear to my heart. I didn't start out being so fervently pro-life, but I've dedicated a good portion of my energy to it. Why? Because becoming a parent showed me how exhausting and exhilarating it is to mother someone and then in time watch them go off and become a gift to others. Having lost a child in miscarriage also helped me understand more pointedly the value of every life and how unrepeatable we are. On that note, I want to share a portion of the interview that happened after I hit record, but before we'd had a chance to restart the interview. Leah's response to my question about the phrase forced birther seemed worth sharing.
The people who are coming for the pro-life arguments may not always feel like they have common cause with feminists who are saying, look, we need more women-specific solutions to things. And my goal in having this be a book is that everyone has kind of an entry point to the book and finds unexpected allies within it.
One of the words that has come at me recently is forced birther.
Yes.
And, a lot of these things, I think, come at us and we're not sure, the normal person, that we can't understand how even to approach that. Can you kind of help us through that, Leah?
I think part of it is, you've got to be honest, right? That like, this always talks as though the natural thing is not to be pregnant or not to have a baby, even when you're pregnant. But no one is forcing you to have a baby. The baby is there. What takes an active intervention is causing the baby to cease to exist, right? That's the path of action. The path of having the baby is the path of no action. A lot of action right at the end, obviously, in labor. But it frames the default in a way that is just fundamentally untrue. And I think this has a long intellectual history. So, I think it's interesting that when you look back at Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's own writing on abortion and jurisprudence, she wasn't on the court for Roe v. Wade, but she's made it really clear through her writings, she never would have grounded a right to abortion in privacy, which is this kind of nebulous claim that, first of all, doesn't really feel like it counterbalances a human life and ultimately didn't stand up to the test of time. For her, the claim for a right to an abortion was grounded in equal protection. And what she said pretty bluntly at times is that, men can always walk away from a child. Women cannot. And so for women to be equal to men, they need the same capacity to not be a mother to someone that men have to not be a father by just abandoning the mother and child together. Now, that's that idea of interchangeability again. And here it's an equality of vice, right? That if men are cowardly, women need the right to be violent to their child.
If men are cowardly, women need the right to be violent to their child. That's a powerful statement. A right response, I think, begins with another word in Leah's book title, dignity. Learning our own dignity and how infinitely valuable we are to God and living that out authentically would bring, I think, a happy end to abortion. So, is dependency a bad word? We never did circle back to the question, but I'm sure you've surmised by now that in my and Leah's view, the answer is a resounding no. It is autonomy that leads to falsehoods. Our dependency is a gift, and when we can recognize this, we can be a gift to one another in a way that will breathe new life into us. Leah offered some very practical ways of cultivating a world in which our dependency on one another is acknowledged and can grow and ultimately help us flourish. If isolation is our modern-day scourge, then our healthy dependency on one another is the beautiful antidote. Finally, Leah told me that her goal for this book is that every person who picks it up will find their own entry point as well as an unexpected ally within it. In our next episode, we'll talk with two guests, both fans of a Southern Gothic fiction writer who died of lupus at 39, but not before making a significant impression on the American literature scene. They'll help answer the question, who was Flannery O'Connor? Until then, don't lose sight of the light.